Sam, appreciate you hopping aboard. You guys have been busy. It's kind of ranking period of the offseason. You guys ranked the starting quarterbacks, which I want to get into. You also graded each team's offseason to this point. You guys gave the Commanders a B plus. Seems like you're pretty high on what they've done. It all started with Adam Peters. Then they went and got Dan Quinn. They found their quarterback in Jayden Daniels. And this is the biggest roster turnover they've had since the mid 40s around here in terms of the percentage of the roster. What do you like so much about what they've done?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to like the overall approach to heading in a completely new direction, clearing house, changing the entire infrastructure under the new ownership. Generally speaking, I think it's good process to hire front office people from successful, well-run organizations, and they've done that with Adam Peters. The Dan Quinn hiring is an interesting one because it's not entirely clear how far down the list of candidates he was for them. If they'd had their choice, if they'd been able to take, whoever they wanted without getting the deal done, if they just handpicked the guy, where would Dan Quinn have been? But, he was a pretty successful head coach the first time around. I think he deserves a second shot based off what he did in Dallas with that defense. And then the turnover in terms of personnel, we brought in a lot of kind of culture setting type players. And then obviously the most important aspect is getting the quarterback at the top of the draft as well. So I think overall a lot of change, but most of it looks like it's been in a very positive direction.
What was missing, in your opinion, from this offseason for Washington?
I don't think there's much missing. It's just that we don't really know the impact that it's going to have. When you're changing over that amount of people, when there's that volume of turnover, inevitably some of it is not going to work, is not going to pay the kind of dividends that you expected to. And we just don't know what that will be until we hit the season.
Sam Monson of PFF is with us on Grant and Danny. So then you guys ranked all the starting quarterbacks. It's always difficult with rookies, right? I think you had Drake Maye, maybe a pick or two, spot or two right ahead of Jayden Daniels. I know you guys, like a lot of us, had Maye ahead of Daniels on your rankings. They like Jayden. How do you go about trying to put a ranking together before we've seen him, and give us some thoughts on what you're hearing about Daniels from afar so far?
Yeah, you're right. It's basically impossible to rank rookies, relative to NFL starters until we see those guys play in the NFL. We can give a best guess as to where they're likely to slot based off what we know of them as college players, as, what their profile is going to project into in the NFL. I think generally everyone at PFF, but it's not a monolith. We're all kind of different takes within the same data ecosystem. But I think pretty much everybody at PFF came down on the Drake Maye side in the Drake Maye versus Jayden Daniels conversation. But certainly personally, it was effectively a coin flip. It's which guys, I don't want to even use the word red flag, which guys' potential concern or weakness were you less scared of, and which guys' positives were you keener on? And I think we all kind of came down on the Drake Maye side of things. But Jayden Daniels, is a great prospect in his own right, and somebody whose at least 2023 tape was an awful lot cleaner than Drake Maye's and could easily be ready to hit the ground running sooner than a guy like Drake Maye.
Sam, how much do you guys take into account situation? Because for me, I like Drake Maye a lot as well, but I think he's going to the abyss. I don't care if you had Tom Brady or Joe Montana or Peyton Manning up there in New England. They're going to struggle this year until they kind of remake that roster. That's just my take. A, would love your opinion on that. But then B, how much situation do you guys take into account in terms of supporting cast, coach, scheme, design, et cetera?
No, I think you're right that Drake Maye has gone to the roughest situation of any of those quarterbacks, really. And we were saying that at the time of the draft, the Patriots had this decision to make. Do you grab the quarterback at number 3, or do you trade down and try and build the infrastructure first and then circle back around for the quarterback? Maybe even not in this draft. And they wouldn't have really had the chance to in this draft, the way the quarterbacks flew off the board, but come and get the guy next year, and get a 2024 or 2025 rather quarterback prospect who gets to step into an offense that's in a much better situation than it would have been the way Drake Maye has to do it. So, they decided to grab Drake Maye. There were potentially trades on the table, but they didn't like any of them enough to move out of that draft spot. But it meant that they were under pressure now to try and add receivers and offensive linemen. in one draft. And, they've added some intriguing players, guys like Jalen Polk and, and players like that, but it's not necessarily going to overhaul that group. And Jayden Daniels, JJ McCarthy, even, Bo Nix probably steps into a better situation in year one.
The PFF ranking, in case you're curious, they had Daniels kind of in a tier with Anthony Richardson, Bryce Young, Drake Maye as the next generation, right there in the mid-20s, ahead of a few guys that are now seen as holdovers like Aiden O'Connell, Sam Darnold, and Jarrett Stidham. Sam Monson is with us here on Grant and Danny. Along with what Danny just asked you, I'm curious, what is your just assessment of this supporting cast? Where is it light? Where is it strong? Do you think they did enough in terms of getting Sinnott to go with Ertz, who's a little long in the tooth? At receiver, we were kind of hoping they'd make a splash. They didn't, but they do have McLaurin, Dotson, and they drafted Luke McCaffrey. And then at running back, they did go get a pass catcher to help out Daniels underneath. And Austin Eckler, the hope is he's got some tread on the tires.
Yeah, I think it's a good receiving core. When you look at supporting cast for a quarterback, I think you can throw it into three different buckets. You can look at the scheme and the coaching, you can look at the receivers, and you can look at the offensive line. I think the receiving core in Washington, I think, is good. It might not be great, but it's good. Terry McLaurin, in particular, is a really high-end receiver. The collection of Jahan Dotson, De'Ami Brown, now Luke McCaffrey, there's enough there, I think, from the receiving core to be a solid and an above-average group. Austin Eckler out of the backfield, I think, is a really important player for a young quarterback as well. And then that addition of Sinnott at tight end and Zach Ertz, I think that's a solid group. The offensive line on paper looks a little bit weaker and more of a concern, and it took them a while to get that offensive lineman in the draft. It's definitely got the ability to be an okay offensive line, but equally it's got the ability to be a concern for a young quarterback as well. So that would be an area. And then the coaching aspect of it is really a question mark as well with Cliff Kingsbury. We don't know how far along he's going to have moved that offense, since the last time we saw him, since that Arizona period where it seemed to have stagnated. It kind of hit a wall and it stopped evolving. Has he taken his time away and evolved the system or taken it in a new direction? Or are we going to see the same offense that was kind of stuck in the mud a little bit, spinning its wheels at the last days in Arizona?
Sam Monson with us here on G&D. So that's what I really want to deep dive on with Kingsbury. There's so little that we know. Like, for example, did they line up in the shotgun 90 whatever % of the time in Arizona because Kyler Murray's short, or that's because that's what Cliff Kingsbury wants to do? You know what I mean? Like, his proclivities here, how would he be best served with this cast, this group now, like, versus what do you think he wants to do? You know what I mean? That a little bit of that push and pull there, Sam. Go into it if you would.
Yeah, he's a really interesting coach because obviously he came from this sort of pure air raid system, came into the NFL, and the initial sort of thought was we're going to see a true air raid come into the NFL and see how it works. And that lasted weeks, not even a month, before he was like, okay, we're going to have to dump the 10 personnel thing. That doesn't work in the NFL, and a couple of other things. And very early on in his NFL career, he showed the ability to completely adjust his scheme and transform it into what was going to work in the NFL. And we changed from 10 to 11 personnel, and the offense made a couple of other adjustments. So on the one hand, he showed he was very quick to be able to adjust his system and make changes. But then the system stopped really evolving and sort of seemed that he'd settled into, okay, I think this is what's going to work in the NFL, and I no longer need to make adjustments. And there are things that the league has been doing in the last few years that everybody's kind of jumped on board with, whether it's pre-snap motion, whether it's moving receivers around so they're not always in the same spot to try and get them more favorable matchups, all these kinds of things. And Kingsbury didn't do those. He kind of kept his receiver. They're going to be in the same spot every snap. I think there's value to kind of cutting the thinking time out from the offense and just out executing a defense because they know where they're going to be. They don't have to think about it. But ultimately, I think the kind of last period of that Arizona offense showed that the net result of that thinking was probably negative to the offense. What you gain in your offense not needing to think and knowing where they're lining up, you more than lose by just not taking advantage of the kind of the ways of exploiting defense and stressing them in other areas. So I think that's the real question is, are we going to see this system moved on so that the starting point is just picking up some of the low-hanging fruit and evolving and changing from what I think can probably work at the college level? I think you can probably out-execute college defenses simply by cutting down the thinking time and make sure people aren't making mistakes. When you watch college football, like most of the big plays are just screw-ups on defense. It's people making mistakes, and that doesn't happen as much in the NFL. It doesn't happen nearly as much. So, you need to force those errors or issues or just more difficult coverage assignments with alignment and with pre-snap motion and with disguise and all these kinds of things. I think that's the area that you want to see growth from within this scheme.
Sam Monson on G&D here on the Fan. Another piece you guys came out with that I wanted to point out for people to go read because it was good. I think it was Trevor Sikkema had this. You guys went through all 32 teams and you gave the top 3 players on every team. And interestingly for DC, maybe not surprisingly, McLaurin and Allen, who often are viewed as kind of the alphas on offense and defense here. And then Frankie Louvu, the free agent addition for Carolina, I'm fired up about. It was a little bit of a Swiss Army knife. Again, you guys don't all have the same opinions, but I'm curious if you have a thought on Louvu coming over and being used with Dan Quinn, who seems to get a lot out of guys like him. Joe Witt, very, very excited to see how they implement him as a playmaker, especially after adding Wagner. It might give them some options to move him around.
Yeah, Frankie Louvu is a really fun player and has been really good for the last few years. I love him in a Dan Quinn defense. I think he could take another step forward, even beyond what we've seen the last couple of years, and excited to see what he can do. The first year he was in Carolina, he graded really well for us in a limited sample size, a pretty small role, but was a really good guy in the blitz, was really good against the run, was this real downhill thumper, and that earned him a sort of full-time starting gig, and he was able to back that up with a really good season as a full-time starter. And then last season was probably the best year we've seen from him, still really good on the blitz, still really good as a downhill thumper, and better in coverage as well that we've seen in the past. So I think he's so good coming forward, almost a sort of old school throwback of a linebacker, a guy that can really make his presence felt as a heat-seeking missile against the run or even as a blitzer, but somebody that's good enough in coverage to hold up on the back end and be on the field every down.
I want to ask about one more on offense real quick, Sam. There's a split sort of set of opinions here on Jahan Dotson, who year one showed some promise, slowed down by an injury a little bit, but when he played, especially down the stretch, getting targets, he was pretty productive. Last year really struggled. I think the answer is yes, because I think it was all, he didn't play great, scheme wasn't great, Sam Howell wasn't great. I think the answer is probably a lot of those things. What's your prognosis for him this coming year, maybe future going forward? Because I agree they probably needed to go get another receiver. They didn't, which shows confidence maybe in Dotson having a bounce-back season.
Yeah, I think it's definitely possible. You're right. Like, it was a bad situation last year. The Sam Howell thing didn't really work as an experiment. Certainly, the longer it went on, the worse it got. So obviously, the receivers are going to suffer from the fact that the quarterback is not making those plays. Dotson was a player that I didn't love as much as many people in the draft that he came out in. I think he generally struggles to separate a little bit against man coverage, but he's a good player in zones, and there's value to that, particularly when you have Terry McLaurin as your number one guy. Dotson can be the number two, can attack the weaker areas of the defense, can certainly make those plays against just the sort of scheme space in zone coverage. And as I say, when we mentioned earlier, the list of receivers that they've got, he can definitely be part of that receiving core. So, yeah, I think it's a big season for him. He needs to have a good year now, but it should be a significantly better situation for him to do that than it was a year ago.
Sam, I'm going to ask you a super weird off the beaten path question, but this has come up a bunch around here. The Washington Commanders now are trying to build a stadium. We don't know if it'll be in D.C., in Virginia, and Maryland. But one of the things I think behind the scenes they're trying to figure out is they're obviously going to do a roof. There's thought about retractable roof versus, just a fully enclosed all the time roof. One of the things I keep hearing is the teams that have retractable roofs barely use them, that they're either open all the time or closed all the time. They don't really go back and forth. So I don't know if you have a thought on that. Also, natural grass versus turf. It seems like everyone's trying to go to natural grass. And if they're leaning toward, which I would imagine they are, just a roof all the time, then how do you grow the grass? And you need to, it's super expensive if you got to get it out into the parking lot to grow. I just wonder where you think we're headed in kind of some of those ways from a stadium standpoint.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see if the players are able to force anything from the league in terms of those natural grass things, because all the players prefer natural grass. I think pretty much to a man. Anyone that's played on turf or grass surfaces, it does feel better. There's more give underneath, and it's not even the surface itself. It's more what's underneath the surface that feels better. There's just so much more give in a natural grass field because there's soil under you, and it goes deeper than any kind of natural turf where you're dealing with some cushioning and then you're ultimately dealing with concrete a couple of inches below your feet somewhere. I think that's the real issue at play here, is it wears more on players when they're playing on turf. Now the downside is turf cuts up, grass cuts up, and any game you watch where they're playing on natural grass, particularly when there's kind of weather, you're going to see slipping, you're going to see the field cutting up, you're going to see guys falling over, and that results in worse football ultimately. So there's a bit of a push and pull there, but the players are definitely keener on one surface than the other. But it is the more awkward one. It's the one that takes, special design in order to grow the field outside, or an open air, an open roof to make it done. It's the one that, does have higher maintenance costs, because if it gets so cut up that you need to replace it, that's the cost you need to budget. So I think it's going to take a lot to force NFL teams off those artificial turf fields. And the more likely thing is you do get some version of an artificial turf surface.